HBO is running an offseason Hard Knocks this year. They are following the New York Giants, and there was quite a stir last week over the handling of the Saquon Barkley situation by Joe Schoen. And it becomes really evident when you watch some of these clips that Joe Schoen really didn't think it was in the cards for Saquon Barkley to return. But I think it's also obvious that he, amongst many, many others, GMs, probably misgauged what the running back market would be. That's not a huge sin in my eyes. There is one thing that he said in here that we'll get to that really would make me do a double take if I were a Giants fan, and I wouldn't be quite so happy about it. But to set the stage and show maybe how Joe Schoen was skeptical of wanting to spend a high dollar amount on Saquon Barkley, here he is at an all-star game practice talking to Frank Gore and an agent, Malki Kawa, about some of the negatives about Saquon Barkley at this point in his career.
I mean, you look at Saquon had like 900 carries at Penn State plus 6 years in the NFL. You got to start saying bang for your buck.
Am I right or wrong that at 27 you guys look at it like running backs? After that, is there steep decline?
Yeah, the data says that. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we tried to get something done last year and we weren't able to. But we could franchise Saquon again for 12 this year.
Okay, so there's some of the key numbers. 12 million you're going to hear a few times, which is the franchise tag value. You franchise Saquon Barkley, and then you got that $12 million sitting on your salary cap until you figure out whether to trade him or get him a new contract or what have you. As far as Saquon Barkley and what you might expect as he gets older, I understand the hesitations GMs have, especially for guys like Saquon Barkley, who hasn't missed a ton of games, but has been banged up a good amount. And it seems like it does affect his production when he is banged up. So those are the things that perhaps Saquon Barkley or AJ Brown could have gotten offended by. But it is also kind of the going philosophy of a lot of GMs in the NFL these days. Here's Shane talking to Giants owner John Mara about some of the nuances of the situation.
Because we're not going to franchise him. Like, it doesn't make any sense to franchise him. So
unless you think you can trade him after doing it.
Right. And then could we get something and trade him? What are we really going to get? Unless it got down to like $7 million. And I don't want to offer that because I don't want to be like we disrespected him.
Okay, so the $7 million there, that seems to be a sticking point for Joe Schoen. I think that's the most he wants to pay for a running back on this rebuilding roster right now. And what they allude to several times in this episode is, okay, if the Giants have to pay part of Saquon Barkley's salary to entice another team to trade for Saquon Barkley, are they willing to do that? And who the hell's going to want to do that anyway? One guy that I think comes out really well in this is the director of pro scouting, Chris Rossetti, at least in terms of how things actually played out for Saquon Barkley in the running back market, where Saquon did get the most lucrative contract in free agency, including more than twice as much guaranteed money as Josh Jacobs. They were similar in average per year, but Saquon Barkley got a boatload more guaranteed money than Josh Jacobs.
The other thing on Saquon we were talked about was he, on the open market, will probably, after we went through it, will probably get the most money just based on the explosive traits he still has. Did Saquon have his best year? No. And I think he'd say that same thing. Put him behind the Detroit offensive line, put him behind Philly offensive line, there might be more value to another team that they'd be willing to kind of give up a pick or an asset to get him.
Yeah, okay, so Philly, right? That sounds pretty prescient by Chris Rossetti there. And it is also important to know that, yeah, running backs have been devalued, but I think teams that look at running backs as perhaps the cherry on top of an offense that's already got a good structure, or a guy like A.J. Brown, running backs have a different value to those teams. It's kind of like if you've got a really nice artillery shell, but no bazooka to launch it from, which is what Saquon Barkley was to the Giants in the offseason or last season, was that got a nice bazooka shell there, but no bazooka. You got to build the bazooka before you can shoot the shell. That's where a team like the Giants probably shouldn't be spending a whole lot of money on a running back. But this is where it gets really weird, is that Shane seemed dead set on arguing even other teams out of wanting Saquon Barkley.
Look at the teams that have running back as a need, because like if you're Philly, like you're thinking defensive back, like where are you going to allocate your funds? As we keep going through our needs, okay, we need a corner, we need rushers, a number one receiver, like that running back keeps going down.
And that's awesome from your own perspective, but like to think that you know what 31 other teams are going to think of your running back, I feel like he might have been a little too blinded by his own evaluation of a 27-year-old running back with a lot of wear and tear on him, and not have understood how highly coveted Saquon Barkley would have been by a team like the Eagles or a team like the Texans, who were reportedly in there with the bidding and not that far off from the Eagles. This is where I start to worry that bias is going to creep in, and there's still not just the coup de grace that I'll show you at the end is the one that really makes me shake my head at the way that Shane handled a lot of this. But then the most glaring example, and this came up a couple times, was just how badly Joe Schoen misgauged the demand for running backs in free agency. Here he is again talking to John Mara.
There's going to be guys, if we're patient, that ended up shaking out. Devin Singletary, who was in Houston, played for 275 this year. Joe Mixon may be a cap casualty, so now you got Saquon, Jacobs, Pollard, Eckler. That's 6 guys right there that are free agents. How many clubs really need running backs where they're going to invest resources in the position? Second week of free agency, I think there'll be some value guys, specifically at the running back position.
All right, so every single one of those guys that he mentioned was gone by the second day of legal tampering. So not only were they not available in the second week of free agency, they weren't available in actual free agency. They got snapped up and agreed to terms before free agency even officially began. Now, I can understand, though, given how dead the free agency market and perhaps the trade market was for Saquon Barkley the year before when the Giants had franchised him. But honestly, at this point, given the fervor there was to sign some of these running backs, not to as much money as they feel they're worth, but to a lot more money than Joe Schoen was talking about, means that I do think they missed out on an opportunity to trade Saquon Barkley. And by the way, that $2.75 million that Devin Singletary played for last year for the Texans, the Giants would double that amount to get him this year at $5.5 million, getting a lot closer to that $7 million that seems to be his magic number. I think it's foolish to think that there wouldn't be other teams or the Eagles themselves, if they wanted to do business with the Eagles, they would be willing to trade up a notable asset. I mean, the Texans gave up a 7th rounder just to pick up Joe Mixon. So let's look at Joe Schoen talking to his entire staff, where Chris Rossetti makes another appearance. Again, I think looking like he has a better feel for what the market for Saquon Barkley would be than really, honestly, anybody else in the organization.
I would say Saquon, franchising and trading him, I don't think is realistic.
Are we positive that nobody's going to pay him that kind of money? There's nobody in the draft. There's no free agents, receivers they're either going to be going back to their team at $20 million.
I mean, who would you say would go sign up running back to that dollar amount?
A team that's, anyone that has money to spend.
There's a lot of running backs in free agency.
Yeah, but are any potential difference makers really? After you watch this film?
So Shane concedes that there aren't any other difference makers. And it is true that you'll never know, right, exactly what a team might be willing to give up until you actually do that. And you got that $12 million cantaloupe sitting on your salary cap. That's a tough spot to be in. But being a GM is all about navigating your way through some of these tough, uncertain situations. But this is the kicker. This is the part that really, honestly, if I were a Giants fan, I would have gotten kind of nauseous if I heard my GM talking this way.
Trading Saquon is a Hail Mary, and the drama and all that goes with it. We did that last year.
It's 10 years off my life dealing with it. Emotionally was draining. We spent a lot of time on it. But again, I don't want that to be the reason that we don't do what's best for the franchise.
All right. Emotionally draining? Dude, emotionally draining. Like this is the whole reason that GMs, if they're good and if they're worth their money, get paid millions of dollars per year. The kind of stuff that us football fans or just the people you're negotiating against, like when I was a player, I know that the GM always had the upper hand because they're the ones who aren't supposed to get emotional about it. That part rubbed me the wrong way. I don't want my GM telling his staff that, well, it's emotionally draining. Of course, we don't want that to be the reason. But I did just say that now, didn't I? And I went, it's emotionally, that's true emotion. I will say, as a compliment to Nick Caserio, throughout that entire Deshaun Watson ordeal, if I were acting as a GM, as an unqualified GM, I would have been so damn petrified about the downside, the potential worst case scenario, which is if the legal situation had gone a lot worse and if no teams had wanted to touch Deshaun Watson, that I would have held on to him way too long and ended up getting I would have dumped him long before Nick Caserio did. Nick Caserio ended up getting a king's ransom for a guy that maybe Joe Schoen would have thought was untradeable, but Deshaun went on and got the best contract that any quarterback still has ever gotten and a boatload of draft compensation back for it. So I simply don't get that part of it. I understand the salary cap implications. I understand building your team solidly before you go out and spend money on a running back to be the cherry on top. But that part, there's just no room for that. And then it's also hard to sit there and listen over and over again about trying to find out if the guy that you decided to pay $40 million per year is actually the right quarterback or not. I don't want to crush Joe Schoen for the entire ordeal because obviously he's not the guy who drafted Saquon Barkley or Daniel Jones and put Saquon Barkley in, frankly, an imperfect situation for many, many, many years. But it is his job to clean it up. And I think they did squander an opportunity to get some draft compensation. And at the very least, and this is a big one, you could have controlled him not going to one of your divisional opponents. Now, Joe Schoen might think, well, yeah, okay, I gave the Eagles a chance to make the wrong move because they shouldn't have paid Saquon Barkley. But you're really putting yourself out there if Saquon Barkley ends up reeling off a couple of 200-yard games versus you this season. Maybe they'll shut him down. And then it'll be a moral victory. That's why they play the games, and that's why it's going to be so much fun. I'll tell you one thing. This Hard Knocks episode was way more interesting and intriguing than I thought it would be, especially when you already know the outcome of a lot of these decisions. And I would also throw in there, look, you never know how these things are edited or what have you. But so far, after week 1 of Hard Knocks offseason, New York Giants, I do think that Chris Rossetti has an inside track on being the next GM of the New York Giants or some other team in the NFL. We'll see.